The border of Caranvast smelled of iron and heather, and I had been dreaming of it for 5 years. Not the throne room, not the great hall with its carved rafters and iron-bracketed torches, not even the high ridge where I had stood as a boy and watched the moorland turn violet at dusk. What I had dreamed of in the dark of a prison cell 1,200 miles from home was the border, the exact moment of crossing it, the way the pack bond would snap back into place like a caught breath, like a door swinging open in a house you feared had burned to the ground. I had held that image in front of me for 5 years, the way a man holds a candle against a cave. It was the only light I had. I crossed just before dawn on foot with 3 of my men who had survived the escape. No horses, no cloaks, nothing but what we had carried in our bodies through 11 days of open country and 2 mountain passes. My hands were cracked from cold. My right side still ached where the broken rib had knit crooked in a place that had no healers. One of my men, Torval, was walking on a wrapped ankle and had said nothing about it since the second pass. We were not a procession. We were not a homecoming. We were 4 men who had refused to die, crawling back across a line we had promised to cross again. The pack bond came back the way I had known it would all at once, a wall of sensation, 5 years of distance collapsing in a single breath. I felt the pack, every wolf, the old threads that had gone slack and silent, snapping taut. I felt the heather under my feet differently, as if the ground recognized the weight of my return and adjusted itself accordingly. Torval looked at me, and I knew he felt it too, even though he was no king and had no such bond. He felt it in me, the change in my breathing, the way I stopped walking for a moment and simply stood, head bowed, eyes closed, letting Caranvast come back into me like water filling a vessel that had been dry too long. And then underneath all of it, separate from all of it and older than any of it, the other thing. The mate bond. I had not expected it to hit me at the border. It had been faint for so long, so faint that in the worst years I had wondered if I had imagined it. A warmth in the left wrist. A sense of direction, the way you know which way is north even in a dark room. I had carried it quietly and said nothing, because in a cell shared with 7 other men there is no language for fated mate bonds and what it means that the thread is still there, still warm when everything else has gone cold. I had not said her name aloud in 5 years. I had said it in my head every single night. Senna, Senna, Senna. The bond did not hit me gently at that border. It hit me like I had walked into a wall, like something that had been held at tension for 5 years released all at once, a cord snapping taut, then thrumming. My left wrist burned, not painful, the opposite of painful. The mate mark, which had been faint as watercolor on damp cloth for the better part of 5 years, flared hot and vivid in the gray morning light, and I stood at the border of my own kingdom, holding my wrist like a man who has just remembered what he is. "My king," Torval said quietly behind me. "She is alive," I said. My voice came out strange. I had not heard that certainty in my own voice in a long time. I knew before anyone told me. I knew before I reached the first settlement, before the first border guard recognized my face and went white with shock and joy, and something else I would have to ask about later. I knew before I heard a single word about what had happened in Caranvast in the 5 years I was gone. I knew because the bond was still there, warm and alive and pointing, the way it had always pointed, the way it pointed the very first time I had felt it, 3 years before the battle that took me, when I had seen Senna across a gathering hall, and my wolf had gone so quiet and so still that for a moment I had thought something was wrong with me. That day I had been too slow. I had been a king with too many obligations and too many eyes watching and too much pride about what it meant to claim a mate formally, properly, in the right order of things. I had begun the careful steps. I had sent word through the right channels. I had done everything at a king's measured pace. And then the battle had come, and I had gone to it the way kings do, and I had not come back for 5 years. And whatever careful steps I had begun were left standing in a half-open doorway with no one to finish walking through them. I asked the border guard, a young man named Edric who had been a boy when I left, what had happened. Not to the pack, not to the hall, to her. He told me. His voice was careful and his eyes would not quite meet mine, and I understood that whatever he was about to say had not been his doing, and he was not sure how I would receive it. I watched his face while he spoke. I kept my own very still. On the day the declaration of death had been made, the day the elders had gathered with their witnesses and their seals and their careful procedure, and declared the king of Caranvast dead in the field, on that day Senna had lost everything. Not through cruelty. That was the part that was somehow harder to hear than cruelty would have been. Through procedure, through the proper order of things. An unclaimed mate, the bond not yet formally sealed, the king declared dead with no heir named. The elder council had been thorough. They had been correct by the old laws. They had stripped her of the standing she had held as a king's intended. They had removed her from the hall. They had assigned her a place at the settlement's edge, a workroom and a set of quarters that were comfortable enough by any common standard, and were an indignity by every standard that mattered, because everyone in Caranvast knew who she was and why she was there, and the wolves in the hall could feel that the bond was not dead. The wolves had not been comfortable with it, Edric said, choosing his words slowly. There had been those who felt it was wrong. There had been arguments, but the elders had the law and the elders had held. She had not argued. That was the part that stopped me. She had not argued, not begged, not made her case. She had gathered what was hers, moved to the settlement's edge, and lived there for 5 years with a dignity so complete and so quiet that even the wolves who had done as the elders decreed found, after a while, that they could not look directly at her. The mate mark on her wrist had faded but never vanished. She had covered it. She had gone about her work. She had not left Caranvast. I have survived many things. I survived 3 years in a cell in the dark. I survived the breaking of bones in ways I will not describe. I survived the particular madness that comes from not knowing, day after day, whether the world you left behind is still standing. What I found harder to survive, standing at the border of my own kingdom in the gray light with my cracked hands and my badly healed rib, was the image of Senna living for 5 years at the edge of a pack that had no right to put her there. "Where is she now?" I said. "The eastern workrooms, my king. The same quarters she has kept since." "How far?" "Perhaps 4 miles from here." I looked at Torval. He read my face without difficulty. We had spent 5 years learning to read each other's faces in conditions that did not allow for speech. "The hall can wait," he said. "Yes," I said, "it can." I had thought in the years of imagining this return that when I saw her again I would know what to say. I had composed 100 versions. Some were formal and some were not. Some began with an apology, and some began with a declaration, and some began with nothing, just her name. I had held them all, turned them over, found reasons why each one was right and reasons why each one was wrong, in the way that men do when they have nothing but time and a thing they cannot change. I had told myself that when the moment came I would find the right words. I did not find them. I found her. She was in the eastern workroom exactly as Edric had said, a low stone building at the settlement's edge, a building that was functional and solid and utterly lacking in anything that had been given to her out of kindness rather than minimum obligation. The door was open. Morning light was coming through the east-facing window in pale horizontal bars. She was standing at a work table with her back half turned, and she was focused on something in her hands. I registered cloth, needle, the small intent frown she had always worn when her attention was fully elsewhere, and she did not hear me in the doorway because I had spent 5 years learning to move in ways that made no sound. For a moment I only looked. 5 years. She was not unchanged. There were things in her face, in the set of her shoulders, that had not been there before, and I recognized them because I had put similar things in my own face during the same 5 years. A person who has survived a long time with nothing but their own steadiness has a certain quality about them, a heldenness, a way of carrying themselves that looks like composure and is also the scar tissue that composure grows over. I knew what that looked like. I had grown it myself. I could see it on her, and it made something in my chest do something I did not have a clean word for, some compound of grief and pride and a very old, very deep tenderness. Her left wrist was covered, as Edric had said. The mate mark. I did not plan what I did next. I lifted my own left hand and held it in the bar of morning light coming through the doorway, and I let the mark show, 5 years dormant, now blazing, now fully itself, the deep silver-gold pattern that had been faint as a watermark for so long and was now so vivid it cast its own faint light. And then I said her name. Senna. She turned. I will not try to describe what happened to her face. I do not have the words, and I do not think words are adequate to it. I know what happened to mine. I have heard it described later by Torval and others who were present at various moments of my return, and they all say the same thing, that I was controlled through everything, the border, the guard's report, the 4 miles of moorland, the doorway, and then I said her name and I was not controlled at all. I believe them. I remember very little of my own face in that moment. I remember hers. She did not run to me. That was what I had expected. What any man expects, I think, after 5 years, that she would close the distance in an instant, that there would be no space between them, and then there would not. But she did not. She stood exactly where she had been standing, her hands still half raised from the work she had set down, and she looked at me, and her eyes went through a sequence of things so fast I could barely follow them. Disbelief, then recognition, then something so raw I had to look down for a moment. And then she simply stood there with tears running down her face, making no move to hide them. And her left hand turned and the sleeve fell back, and the mate mark on her wrist came into the light at exactly the same moment as mine, and they answered each other. The heat of it was immediate and total. Not painful. Every description I have heard of the bond completing makes it sound like a strike, like lightning, like something violent. It was not that. It was the opposite of that. It was the resolution of a chord that had been held half-finished for 5 years, the 4th note finally placed, the suspension released. It was like putting something down. An enormous weight I had carried so long I had stopped noticing it as weight, suddenly set on a table, and my arms coming up empty and light. I crossed the workroom. I do not remember crossing it. I remember being in the doorway, and then I remember being close enough to see the grain of the old stone wall behind her, and I had her hands in mine, her left wrist in my left hand, the marks together. And I said nothing for a very long time because there was no single thing that was the right thing to say first, and so for once in my life, as a king, I made no attempt to order it. After a while she said, very quietly, I knew. I looked at her. The mark, she said, it never went fully cold. Some days it was almost nothing, but it was never nothing. She paused. I did not know if that meant you were alive. I chose to believe it did. 5 years. 5 years she had sat with a faint warmth in her wrist and a choice about what to believe. I'm sorry, I said, for all of it, for leaving before the bond was sealed, for what I stopped, started again. I should not have left it unfinished. You did not choose to be taken. I chose to leave before I had made you safe, I said. I will not make that mistake again. She looked at me a long time. The morning light was full and bright now, both wrists together on the table between us, the marks blazing. She said, you look like you've been through something terrible. So do you, I said. Something moved across her face, not quite a smile, something more complicated and more real than a smile. Then we match, she said. There is a piece of this I did not allow myself to feel in the hours immediately after. I had years of being a king, and kings are trained to the order of things, and I knew that the bond completing was not the end of what I needed to do, it was the beginning. I had a pact to return to, a hall to reclaim, elders to face, a kingdom that had been running without its king for 5 years and had, from what I could see, run adequately but not as it should have. I had decisions to make and people to face, and a great deal of the machinery of governance that had been waiting 5 years for my hand to return to it. I did all of it. I am not a man who leaves things undone. But I did it in a particular order, my order. The first thing I did, before I went to the hall, before I presented myself to the elder council, before I allowed the pack to formally acknowledge my return, was walk back through the settlement with Senna at my side. Not behind me, at my side. I had thought about this on the walk from the eastern workrooms toward the settlement. I had thought, there are 2 ways to do this. There is the version in which I return to the hall first, take back my seat, and then deal with the matter of Senna as a formal matter in the proper order of governance. A claiming ceremony, done right, done with all the ceremony such things are owed. And there is the other version. The version where I make absolutely certain, before I step back into anything, that no one in Caranvast is unclear on what I think of what was done in my absence and what I intend to do about it. I chose the other version. Word travels fast in a pack. By the time we were a quarter-mile into the settlement, people had come out of their doors and their buildings, drawn by the pull of something they could feel but had not yet seen. By the time we were halfway to the hall, there were wolves lining both sides of the path. Some I recognized. Some who had been boys and girls when I left and were adults now. All of them quiet and still, with that particular stillness that a pack has when it feels something larger than itself happening and has the sense to let it happen. They looked at her and they looked at me and they looked at our wrists. There was no need to explain. The marks were enough. They had felt the bond completing at dawn. Every wolf in Caranvast had felt it, the faint seismic shudder of a thing finally resolved, the particular note of it that said, "This is the mate bond of the king." I had felt them feel it. I had felt the ripple of it move through the pack threads even as I stood in the workroom. They knew. They had known for 5 years, if I am honest. They had known the day the elders stripped Senna of her standing, and some part of every wolf in the pack had been quietly wrong about it and had had no mechanism for saying so. Wolves know the bond. You can overrule it with law. You cannot make the pack not feel it. They had felt it, faintly, for 5 years. The mark on her wrist had been faint enough that it could be argued with, but every wolf who had passed within range of her had felt the thread of it. Every wolf who had been asked to treat her as ordinary had managed it only by not thinking about what their instincts were telling them. They were not having to try anymore. I watched it happen as we walked, the change in them, the way the quiet shifted from uncertainty to something else. A wolf near the front of the gathering, an older woman named Harris, who had been on the elder council when I left and who I had certain plans for regarding those council decisions. I watched Harris's face change as Senna walked past, not from hostility to welcome. From the closed-off expression of someone who has spent 5 years managing a cognitive dissonance, to the open expression of someone for whom that dissonance has just resolved. She looked at Senna the way you look at something you have been trying not to see and have finally allowed yourself to see. Senna did not look at them. She kept her eyes forward, her posture exactly the posture it had been in the workroom, not cold, not haughty, but composed in the way that 5 years of enduring had made her composed, like a thing that has been tested long enough to know its own strength. She did not look for approval. She did not look for the moment when they accepted her. She walked the way she had walked for 5 years, as though the question of her worth had already been settled and was simply waiting for the rest of the world to catch up. I had always known she was remarkable. I had known it the first time I saw her, known it in the way my wolf went still and the bond hummed its first note. I had understood it better in the years of captivity, when the warmth of the thread was the thing I followed in the dark. I understood it completely now, watching her walk through a settlement that had given her nothing for 5 years and keeping exactly the face she had always had. Quiet, steady, unbowed. When we reached the hall doors, I stopped, and she stopped with me, and I turned to the gathered wolves, and I did something I had not formally done in 5 years. I spoke as their king. I had considered on the walk across the moorland what I would say. I had considered formal language, the old forms of address, the traditional phrasing for returning kings. I had rejected all of it. Traditional phrasing is for situations that require the weight of ceremony to carry them. This situation required something else. "My name is Aldrich Sorn," I said. "I have been king of Caranvas since I was 23 years old. I was taken 5 years ago and I have come back. That is all I will say about where I have been." I let a moment pass. "What I will say about what I found here. I walked the border of my own kingdom at dawn, and the first thing I felt before the pack bond, before the familiar pull of home, was the mate bond. She was alive. She was here. And she had spent 5 years at the edge of a pack that had no right to put her there." No one moved. No one spoke. "I understand the law that was applied," I said. "I am not saying the elders acted without procedure. I am saying that every wolf in this pack has known for 5 years that the procedure was wrong. I felt you knowing it, through the bond threads, faint as they were. I felt the discomfort of it. You managed it. You all managed it, and I understand why. You had no king and you had a council, and you did what wolves do when they have no one to name the thing they're feeling." I paused. "I am naming it now." I took Senna's hand, her left hand in my left, both marks together, both blazing in the morning light. "This is my mate," I said. "She has always been my mate. The bond was present before I left. Every wolf in Caranvas could feel it. What was done in my absence was done by law and not by feeling, and the law and the feeling have never agreed on this. I am the king, and I say they will agree from this day forward." I looked down the gathered faces, slow enough that it was clear I was seeing each of them. "She bore 5 years of quiet for a king most of you had given up on. I did not give her up. She did not give me up, and Caranvas will remember that." Then I said the words. The formal words of claiming, the old form, older than the hall, older than the laws the elders had used, the words that needed no ceremony and no council and no procedure because they were older than all of those things. I had rehearsed them in my head for 5 years in a prison cell, and I said them now without hesitation, my hand around hers, the marks speaking to each other in the morning light. She said the answer. I had not known if she would. In the formal claiming, the one being claimed has the right to decline. I had not asked her beforehand if she would say the answer, because I did not believe a king should hold a claiming with the outcome pre-negotiated. If she had declined, I would have honored it. I would have made it right in some other way, in whatever way she chose. She did not decline. She said the answer in the same quiet voice she used for everything. The voice I had heard her use in the workroom, unhurried and certain, as if the 5 years of waiting had only clarified her certainty rather than eroding it. The pack went still the way a pack goes still when something true happens in front of it, not the controlled stillness of ceremony, the uncontrollable stillness of a thing landing. I looked at the elder council. Harris and the others who had made the declaration, who had applied the law, who had stripped Senna of her standing on the day they had decided I was dead. I looked at them long enough to be clear, and I said, "We will speak of this in the hall." And I let them understand from my tone that it was not an invitation. Then I turned back to Senna, and I brought her through the hall doors first. What followed was, in the ways of governance, a long and complicated several weeks. A king does not return from 5 years of captivity and find everything tidy. He finds decisions made in his absence that must be honored and decisions made in his absence that must be undone, and the work of sorting one from the other requires patience and clear eyes and a great deal of restraint in situations where less restraint might have felt more satisfying. I did this work. I am not a man who lets feeling override process when process is what the situation requires. I faced the elder council on the third day, not in anger or not only in anger, which would have made me less effective. I faced them clearly, with the law in front of me and 5 years of careful thought at my back, and I named what they had done and what it had cost, and I made clear what was going to change. Not all of them had been comfortable with it. I told those ones that their discomfort was noted and was correct, and that I expected it to have translated into action, and that it had not, and that future such situations would translate differently because I was now here to ensure that they did. Harris took it well in the end. She was not a bad person. She was a person who had had an institution and no mechanism for going against it. She was the first to kneel when the kneeling was called for, and she was the first to offer Senna the formal acknowledgement that had been owing for 5 years, and she did it without being asked, which I respected. Some of the others were less graceful about it. I gave them time. Grace under correction is a thing that takes practice, and they were newly practicing. The PAC's adjustment was both faster and more complicated than I had expected, which is to say it was exactly as fast and complicated as things in a PAC always are, which is to say, faster than a human institution and more complicated than an outsider would predict. The wolves had felt the bond. They had felt it for 5 years. The formal claiming did not tell them anything they did not already know. It gave them permission to act on what they knew, which is a different thing but a necessary one. Once they had the permission, the adjustment was quick. The wolves who had been uncomfortable with Senna's situation, the ones who had not been able to look at her directly, found, to what I think was their own surprise, that they felt better. The cognitive dissonance that had been quietly grinding away for 5 years simply stopped. The PAC threads, which had carried a faint wrong note for all that time, settled. The wolves who had been too comfortable with her situation, who had perhaps made use of the permission the elders gave them to treat her as less, were slower. They felt the weight of the PAC bond's judgment on them, and wolves feel that kind of weight exactly as heavily as they should, and the weight did the work that my orders alone could not have done. By the end of the first month, there was not a wolf in Carinvast who behaved toward Senna as though she were anything other than what she was. She handled it the way she handled everything, with a patience that was not passivity and a dignity that was not coldness. She did not hold the 5 years against the wolves who had participated in her displacement. She did not perform forgiveness, either. She did not go out of her way to reassure those who felt the guilt of it, because she was not responsible for managing their guilt. She simply was what she had always been in the new context, and let the new context do the work. I watched her in those weeks with an attention that I did not try to disguise. I had missed 5 years. I intended to waste none of the years that followed. There was a night, 3 weeks after my return, when the hall had gone quiet and the fires were low and Senna, and I were sitting near the hearth in the rooms that were now hers as much as mine. She had a piece of work in her hands. She was always working on something. It was one of the 10,000 things I had had to relearn about her in the weeks since my return. And I was watching the fire, and neither of us was speaking, and the silence was the particular silence of 2 people who have found that the other's company fills a space that nothing else has filled. She said without looking up, "What kept you in the years of it?" I considered the question. I had not spoken much about the captivity, not because I was unwilling, but because it is not a simple thing to describe, and most descriptions of it are inadequate in a way that frustrates me. But this was not most conversations. "The warmth," I said, "in the wrist." She was quiet. "It would go very faint some days." "Almost nothing." I turned my left hand over on my knee, looking at the mark that was now so vivid it seemed part of me the way blood is part of me. "On those days I did not think about whether you were alive. I thought, it is not gone. It is faint, but it is not gone, and I waited for it to come back." I looked at her. It always came back. She put her work down. I had learned in 3 weeks that she put things down only when what she was thinking required her full attention. She looked at her own left wrist for a moment, and then she looked at me. "The same," she said. "The same thing. I thought some days I thought perhaps it means nothing. Perhaps the mark simply takes a long time to die. Perhaps I am reading warmth into something that is only memory, and then I would think, no. It is there, it is not memory, it is there. She paused. I chose to believe it. 5 years, I said. 5 years. We sat with that for a moment. There was not much else to say about it. We had both done the same thing from opposite ends of the same thread for 5 years. We had felt the faintness, and we had chosen the only interpretation that kept us standing, and we had been right. Not because belief makes things true, because the bond was true, and we had simply managed to read it correctly in the dark. I said after a while, I would have come sooner if I could have. I know, she said. I would have sealed the bond before I left if I had known. You could not have known. Senna. She looked at me. I am not asking for forgiveness, I said. You have nothing to forgive, I know that. What I am saying is that I understand what those 5 years were, and I understand what you bore, and I will not diminish it by pretending that because the law was applied correctly the cost was nothing. I held her gaze. The cost was enormous. You paid it. I see that clearly. She was quiet for a long moment. Something in her face was doing the thing it did when she was deciding whether to say the full version of something or the contained version. I waited. It was the hardest thing I have ever done, she said finally. Not the circumstances. I could bear the circumstances, the quarters, the loss of standing, the pack's discomfort. That was survivable. What was hardest was not knowing if you were alive. Not knowing if what I was feeling in my wrist was real. Not knowing whether I was waiting for something that would come or whether I was. She stopped, began again. The uncertainty was the weight. Everything else was just weight on top of the weight. I reached across and covered her wrist with my hand, my thumb over the mark. Not a gesture of claim, not even a gesture of comfort exactly, just contact, presence. The simplest possible way of saying, I know where you are now, I know where I am. I am here, I said. It is no longer uncertain. She turned her hand and held mine, and we sat there in the firelight without speaking for a long time, and the hall was quiet around us, and somewhere outside the moorland was dark and the wolves of Caranvast were moving through it. And for the first time in 5 years, I felt the full shape of what I was and was not afraid of it. The ceremony, when it came, was her choice. I had told her that was how it would be, that I had made the claiming at the hall doors not because it was less than she deserved, but because it was what was needed in that moment, the unmistakable public first act that left no room for confusion about my intentions. But the ceremony, the formal installation of a queen, the rite with its old words and its gathered pack and its deliberate weight, that was hers to choose, and I told her so. She thought about it for a week. I did not press her. I watched her thinking, in the way I had spent 3 weeks relearning how to watch her, the frown when she was working something through, the way she went quiet at particular moments, the way she sometimes spoke to the wolves who came and went through the hall with a naturalness that had apparently never left her even in 5 years at the settlement's edge. The pack spoke to her easily now. More easily, I thought, than they had spoken to me since my return. But then she had been here, and I had been gone, and there is an ease that comes only from presence. On the 8th day, she said, I would like the ceremony to be small. I had expected this. Small, I agreed. And I would like to write what I say, she said. Not the old form. I want to say what is true, not what is traditional. I looked at her. If that is allowed, she said. You are going to be the queen of Caranvast, I said. You may determine what is allowed. Something moved across her face again, the not quite smile, the more complicated and more real thing. That will take some adjusting too. You have 5 years of practice adjusting to things, I said. She held my gaze for a moment, and then she laughed. Quietly, briefly, not a performance, a real sound, unguarded, the first one I had heard from her. And it was specific and particular and unlike any sound anyone else had ever made in any room I had been in. I knew I would know it for the rest of my life. The ceremony was small. The hall was not empty. The elder council was there, and the senior wolves, and a handful of others who had been witnesses to various things in the past 5 years. But it was not the full gathered pack, not the thunderous formal occasion that a different queen might have wanted. Senna stood before the hearth and addressed the color of heather, her left wrist bare for the first time before the pack in 5 years, and she said the words she had written. I will not record them here completely. They are hers. But I will say this. She did not mention the 5 years as grievance. She did not name what had been done to her as injustice, not once, not with a word. She spoke about the bond. She spoke about what it means to feel something real and to choose to trust that it is real when you have no proof and no promise and nothing but the warmth in your wrist. She spoke about what Cairnvast was to her, not what it had been to her in the hard years, but what it was now. The pack whose threads she could feel in the way she could feel her own breath, present and ordinary and vast. She said she did not come to this as a stranger who had survived long enough to be accepted. She came to it as someone who had always been of it, and was only now standing in the room where that could be said aloud. The wolves in the hall were very quiet. I said what I had written when it was my turn. It was shorter than hers. I am better at decisions than I am at speech. I said, I was a king who left a bond unfinished and was taken before I could finish it, and returned to find that the woman I had left it unfinished with had held the thread in the dark for 5 years without being asked, and without being promised anything. I said that was not a thing I deserved. I said that the rest of my kingship would be the attempt to be worthy of it. Harris, standing to the left of the hearth, made a sound that she immediately controlled, but not before I heard it. I did not look at her directly. Some things are allowed to pass unacknowledged. Senna looked at me through everything I said. When I was finished, she stepped forward, and we completed the ceremony without theatrics, with the old words and the old gestures and the bond between us burning so clearly that the youngest wolves in the room afterward said they had felt the warmth of it from across the hall. I do not know if that is true. I know I felt it. I have felt it every moment since I crossed the border at dawn and my wrist blazed back to life, and I do not believe I will stop feeling it. Cairnvast has changed in 5 years and has changed again since my return, and the second set of changes is the kind I prefer to oversee. There are wolves in this pack who are better than they knew they were and worse than they are capable of being, which is true of every pack that has ever existed, and my work is, and will remain the patient, complicated task of helping the gap between those two things narrow. I am equipped for this work. I was trained for it, and then I was tested by years that no one would have chosen for their training, and I came out of it with a clearer idea of what matters and a reduced interest in what does not. What matters, the bond threads kept honest, the hall kept fair, the pack given the tools to be as good as it is capable of being and held accountable when it falls short. The queen, given what she has always been owed. This is what I think about. On mornings when the hall is full, and the moorland light comes through the high windows, and Senna is somewhere I can find in 30 seconds, and the mate bond is present in my wrist like a heartbeat, I have grown so accustomed to that I can no longer imagine the wrist without it. There was a morning not long ago when I woke before dawn and lay still in the dark and felt the pack threads all at once, the full weight of Cairnvast, everyone asleep, everyone present, the quiet hum of a pack at rest. And underneath it, as always, older than the pack bond and less reducible, the warmth in my left wrist that had been the only candle in the dark for 5 years. Now it was simply there, a given, a constant, the most ordinary and the most extraordinary thing. I turned my hand over in the dark and felt the mark, vivid and warm. She had held the thread. In 5 years of silence and uncertainty and indignity and a faintness that might have been read 100 different ways, she had held the thread and chosen the interpretation that was correct, not because she was certain, because she chose to be. I have known many kinds of courage. I have known the kind that shows itself in battle, in the cold decisions of command, in the management of pain. I knew, that morning in the dark, that none of the kinds I had known before were quite like this one. The courage of a woman who kept faith with something invisible for 5 years in a room at the edge of a pack that had given her nothing, and simply waited. The wrist was warm. Outside, the moorland was beginning to gray toward dawn, and the wolves of Carinvast were stirring, and the hall was filling with the sounds of mourning, and Senna was there, and I was home. This is where the story ends, and where everything else begins.